All right. Bill Maher has gotten himself in trouble with the left yet again for a monologue he delivered on his show on Sunday. And he's being accused, because of this, what you're about to hear, because of these remarks, he's being accused of white supremacy and actually justifying slavery. But let's listen and find out if that is a fair characterization.
Did Columbus commit atrocities? Of course. But people back then were generally atrocious. Everybody who could afford one had a slave, including people of color. The way people talk about slavery these days, you'd think it was a uniquely American thing that we invented in 1619. But slavery throughout history has been the rule, not the exception. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans, all the way up through R. Kelly. The Holy Bible is practically an owner's manual for slaveholders. The word slave comes from Slav, because so many Slavic people were enslaved, and they're as white as the Hallmark Channel. Who do you think gathered the slaves from the interior of Africa to sell to slave traders? Africans, who also kept their own slaves.
And the whole monologue is quite good. He goes on for about 8 minutes. It's worth listening to. Putting aside the dig at the Bible there, which is silly and not true, the rest of it I basically agree with. And it's also not true that people back in earlier times were generally atrocious. It's not like they weren't worse people, but they lived in a different time. They lived in a more brutal time. But generally speaking, the message there, I agree with it. In fact, it might remind you of something. It might remind you of a monologue that I delivered on this show very recently. You know, it's very similar. Now, I'm not accusing Bill Maher of listening to my show. I would never accuse anybody of that. But we have had a similar conversation, and I'm glad that Maher's talking about it. It's important because it helps us to actually understand historical events when we put them in context, right? You can't understand anything about history until you understand the context of the people that, you know, the context that people lived in back in those days. It's funny, in fact, that the left cares deeply about context when we're discussing, say, the brutality of modern day criminals, non-white criminals anyway. So if we see another one of those videos of someone who's out on bail and has a lengthy rap sheet just randomly brutalizing someone, or there was one recently of someone robbing a convenience store and putting the cashier on his knees and then executing him, shooting him in the back of the head. And of course, that person, lengthy rap sheet, criminal, I think that person was out on bail, I believe. Many videos like that. And whenever we see these videos, what we hear from the left is that, we have to understand the context. We have to understand the systemic racism and all the things that they've suffered in their community. We have to understand that. And the context becomes an excuse that lets the criminals off the hook and back into the community to victimize even more people. But then somehow they're totally uninterested in analyzing the context for anyone who lived on Earth prior to the modern age. So people that are living today, some people anyway, get the benefit of context, but nobody who lived before us gets the same grace. They're all expected to just know better. But with that attitude, you can never understand history. And if you refuse to understand history, then studying it is pointless and impossible. There's another reason why this matters also. It's that it can give us an opportunity to analyze ourselves. Like the fact that everyone in the world supported slavery for thousands of years, that almost no one voiced any objection to the practice in principle. Now, there were people who objected to certain elements of the practice and objected when it was particularly brutal, but as far as someone saying slavery itself is wrong, human beings are all equal, like that sort of thing, there was almost no one making that claim for thousands of years of human history across the entire world. And that fact ought to make us reflect on ourselves because it goes to show how powerful a dominant cultural narrative can be. It's the power of the spirit of the age. If everyone accepts something, everyone does, and nobody questions it, then it's very difficult to view that thing in a critical light because you haven't been given the framework for being critical of it. Everything you've ever encountered, every opinion you've ever heard, everything around you serves to reinforce this cultural narrative. And this force is so powerful that it even protected slavery from criticism for millennia. Now, I think a lot of modern people, they say to themselves, well, if I was born 500 years ago, I would have known better. Everyone that existed in the world for thousands of years, they were all morons. If only I was there, I would have told them. I would have known. But you almost certainly would not have known better because you only know now that slavery is wrong because everyone you've ever met from birth onwards believes it was wrong and told you that. You were told from birth that it's wrong. You don't get any credit for that revelation. Other people had that revelation, and it's correct. It's a correct, and they passed it on to you. They told you. Everything in your life reinforces the idea that slavery is wrong, thankfully. So given that you've existed in this context, it's just meaningless to declare that you would have arrived at the same conclusion had the context been exactly the opposite of what it is today. Now, the point here is not relativism. Okay, it's not that slavery was okay back then because everyone thought it was. If you're a relativist, then that would have to be your conclusion. We're going to talk more about relativism in the Daily Cancellation. But if you're actually a relativist and if you believe we all get our own truth and there's no objective truth, then you of all people have no basis for condemning anyone, really, but especially people in history, and especially when it comes to something like slavery, because it was their truth that slavery was okay. Who are you to say otherwise? But I'm not a relativist. I believe that there is objective truth and objective moral truth, and it was objectively wrong even then. But the point, again, is just to understand the power of a dominant cultural narrative. So here's one way to know that you would not have opposed slavery. If you're asking yourself, would I have opposed slavery if I lived 500 years ago or 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago? Well, here's one way to know that you would not have opposed it. If today all of your views and beliefs and ideas and opinions line up perfectly with like Disney and Apple and Hollywood movie studios and the people who run Twitter and Facebook, okay, if everything you believe lines up perfectly with those organizations and what they profess, then you would have supported slavery. 1,000% certain that you would have. How do I know that? Because you are the sort of person who simply accepts and adopts whatever ideas are dominant and popular and supported by the cultural institutions of the day. It's not a coincidence. It just happened to be that your point of view, your worldview lines up perfectly with all of the dominant cultural institutions. No, they told you, they are the dominant cultural institutions. They're the most powerful institutions in the country. They've told you what to believe, and you believe it. And if that's the case, then it only stands to reason that if you had lived in a time when all the most powerful cultural institutions said that slavery was okay, you would have believed that too. Now the powerful cultural institutions say that women have penises, men can give birth to babies. There are lots of people in this country who say, well, I guess that's the case then. Twitter wouldn't lie to me about that. Well, before you go, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. And while you're at it, if you want to go watch or listen to my full show, head to dailywire.com and subscribe. You can also catch my show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. So go check it out now. I demand it. Your compliance is somewhat appreciated.